through. All of these wonderful people will be introduced by my incredible colleague who I am introducing now. So I would like to have everyone help me to welcome Professor Matt Johnson. Matt is a professor in the creative writing department here at the University of Oregon. His output is prolific, and I won't touch upon all of it, but his novels include Drop, Hunting in Harlem, Him, American Book Award winner Loving Day, and he has forthcoming in June of next year the book The Invisible Things. His creative nonfiction output includes The Great Negro Plot, and among all of his many comics projects, he's done a lot of writing. He has graphic novels Incognegro, Dark Reign, Right State, and Incognegro Renaissance. He is also a screenwriter, among other things, and has been working on the Netflix up-and-coming show, The Fall of the House of Usher. So please help me to welcome Matt to the stage.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Kate Stallings, for doing so much. So I'll just, since I can't name it all, we'll just jump right in. All right, we have an incredible group of talented people here today, and we're going to hopefully talk to them about some interesting stuff. First, we have Harado Alba. He's a cartoonist from Mexico City whose work ranges from journalism to slice of life and science fiction. Alba received his MA in sequential art from the Savannah College of Art and Design and was a college professor of art at Querétaro, Mexico. He is currently an editor at the Latin American division of Webtoon. His comics have been published by The Nib, Pop Games, and Boom Studios. In 2015, he co-founded Little Red Bird Press and took on the role of art director. In that role, he has participated in the creation and publishing of works like Sex Bomb Strikes Again, Blocked, Stories from the World of Online Dating, and Backpiece. In 2017, he won the Jóvenes Creadores Young Creators Grant from the National Fund for Culture and Arts in Mexico. And in 2018, he won a grant for an artist residency in, I don't speak French, Angoulême. Is that close? No. It's a nice place. From the French Embassy and the Mexican government. All right, so big hand for Harado Alba. Dan Archer has been working as a graphic journalist for over a decade. He focuses on human rights related topics in his work and is accustomed to respecting the sensitivities associated with the telling of stories of survivors of human trafficking, sexual exploitation of minors, domestic violence, mental health, homelessness, incarceration, and state-sponsored violence. His work has been supported by the BBC, Vice, the US State Department, Associated Press, the Colombian government, Open Society, European Journalism Center, and he has a Maynard Institute Award for mental health reporting. In 2015, he founded Empathetic Media, a mixed reality production studio, to expand his interactive journalism into the immersive space. Since then, EM has produced dozens of virtual, augmented, and mixed reality experiences from 360 videos to room-scale pieces for a wide range of clients, including the Washington Post, Pfizer Foundation, Gilead Life Services, and the NHS. He's also working on a doctoral thesis at UCL focused on measuring the impact of pro-social behavior interventions inside the immersive experience using biosignals. And he's been here all week and talking to our students in our community. Big hand for Dan Archer. Sarah Murk is a graphic journalist, editor, and teacher. She is the author of Guantanamo Voices, an illustrated oral history of Guantanamo Bay Prison. She is also a zine maker and illustrator whose comics have been featured in The Nib, The New Yorker, Bitch, and NPR. Sarah began her career as a reporter for alternative weekly newspapers, The Stranger and the Portland Mercury. From 2013 to 2017, she worked as the online editor of national feminism and pop cultural nonprofit Bitch Media. Starting in January 2017, she moved on to become a contributing editor at the graphic journalism website The Nib, and also works as a writer on The Nib's animation series, which garnered 9 million views in its first season. Comics she edited for The Nib were nominated for 2 Eisners in 2020, She currently also works as a digital engagement producer for Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting. She co-wrote the investigative comic series in Vulnerable, illustrated by T. Bowie, which won an RFK Human Rights Award for Journalism in 2021. She is the author of several books, including You Do You, Figuring Out Your Body, Dating and Sexuality, Sex from Scratch, Making Your Own Relationship Rules, Open Earth, and the self-published collection Year of Zons. She is an adjunct professor in Portland State University's MFA in Art and Social Practice, where she teaches a graduate seminar on writing and research. Sarah holds a degree in history with honors from Grinnell College. She identifies as white, cisgendered, and queer. In her free time, she befriends strangers' dogs. Welcome to Sarah. And finally, Ben Passmore is the author of the ongoing comic series, Day Gleyhole, sorry, I keep wanting to pronounce this right, Day Gleyhole, as well as the Eisner award-winning nominated Ignatz award-winning comic collection, Your Black Friend and Other Strangers. He also wrote and illustrated Sports is Hell, which won a 2021 award for Best Single Issue Comic. Passmore collaborated with Ezra Clayton Daniels on BTTM FDRS with Fantagraphics. His forthcoming book, The Black Arms to Hold You Up, is a graphic history of 6 black activists and their armed resistance against racism and the police state. Ben contributes graphic reportage and political comics to publications such as The Nib and The New York Times. He lives in Philadelphia. Welcome as well to Ben Passmore. You never thought when you accomplished so much that some poor man was going to have to list all of these things.
Those bios are so long.
Well, you've done so much. Okay, so just to start off the conversation, we're going to try and just basically get the opportunity to see you guys talking about your work and to each other and to have community engagement, and we'll open up questions for the rest of the room as we go. But to start off, here's a question from me. All of your projects, even though you all have accomplished so much, each one of those projects is incredibly time-consuming, and there's so many things I'm sure that you want to write about. I mean, just today we're reeling from the Rittenhouse verdict, but there's something every day it seems like that is worth an entire book-length exploration. How do you pick which things that you want to spend your time on? Is it just a feeling of connection, or is it a logic system that you apply to it? Anybody can respond.
I feel like a lot of times for me it's like a visceral feeling that I feel a connection with the story, or to a certain extent like there's always like a sense of, I don't know if responsibility is a word, but that somebody should be covering certain parts. Like a lot of my work is focused on issues that deal with Latinx communities, relationship, like Latinx relations between the U.S. and like multiple countries, especially Mexico. And very often it's hard to find pieces that cover those things. So it's always like, I mean, if nobody's doing it, I mean, I kind of have to, especially if somebody pays for it, like that's probably all the better. But yeah, there's like a mixture of those two.
Yeah, I would just add that simultaneously, yeah, it's presenting stories maybe that obviously haven't been told as much and received as much coverage, and particularly trying to get close to them in a way that maybe hasn't been done before, or use the mechanisms of comics, to tell the story, so that it's not just the comics version of a New York Times investigation or something like that, but it's a situation where people don't want to be on camera or something like that, and obviously like I think you do have to be slightly strategic, because if you're going to do a graphic novel, it'll be years of work. So bearing in mind, trying to be at least a little strategic, but it's definitely much more of the connection with the people you're interviewing and sort of sharing their story.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in terms of like how much space I have to work with, is one thing. Like often I'm responding to someone hitting me up and being like, "You want to write about this? You got this much space." I think for me, like I don't know. I mean, to live in America is to take a whole lot of things personally. And I usually start from there, you know what I mean? I think one of the difficulties, or I found like one of the difficulties of comics is that, you know, there's the one expectation to sort of present something with some sort of neutrality, but you start sort of editorializing immediately when you start drawing, you know? So for me, I think over time, the combination of knowing that I will editorialize immediately and that I take certain things personally, I just sort of go with it, you know what I mean? Like before the Rittenhouse verdict, you know, I was watching the court cases like a lot of other people, or at least thinking about it. So I sort of go from there, and I think more recently, I think I've gotten like, because of my own sense of unmooredness, particularly after, you know, as far back as Occupy, or, you know, the first time the Black Lives Matter movement was sort of like dwindling on the streets, I was like, you know, fuck around. I mean, you know, a lot of shit works in cycles. You know, you would be, you know, sort of, or I think I would be sort of like silly if I didn't see that, you know, this sort of period resembles other periods. So I think I find myself like pulling back for a broader picture quite a bit and picking things that feel like they can be understood on a continuum, you know. This feels like a kind of responsibility, specifically in this period of time where more people feel unmoored more often, you know. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think that's really beautifully said, yeah. Yeah, I think that's really beautifully said. Yeah, people often ask, like, how do you come up with ideas? And that makes it sound like you sit down and, like, write a list of ideas out, which I've never done. Or been, like, assigned an idea, like, you should go write about this, which has also never happened to me. Instead, I just sort of, like, pay attention to the world and have a lot of things that I feel compelled to express. So I don't even, like, really think about ideas for comics. I just am sort of, like, compelled to make them. And then when I have something I'm sort of processing and working through, I get this kind of like itchy feeling that's not settled until I make the comic about it. So for me, in that way, like comics are a way of like processing what I'm thinking about and seeing and experiencing in the world. The artist Linda Berry has this great quote where she says, comics are a way of paying attention. And I think if you're paying attention to the world, you see things all the time that you want to respond to and talk about and think through. And so that's what I feel like my comics are, is just like sort of a way to process the world. And when it's something that's a more serious nonfiction comic like Guantanamo Voices, that's something like Harado said that I feel like a responsibility to cover because it's something that's left out of what I'm seeing in media. So I'm the kind of person where like when I read the news, I usually get like pretty angry about like what's not being said, or it just feels really insipid to me, the framing of stories most of the time. And so that's a good kind of motivation to be like, what do I wish was being said? What voices are being left out of media that I want to add? Or what's sort of like, what part of the conversation is missing that I feel like I can contribute to and add to this, rather than just reiterating what's already out there. So that's what I felt like. Like with Guantanamo, it felt like, okay, I'm not seeing the kind of discussions around this that I think are really important, and I'm not seeing the kind of voices centered that I think are really important. So if you don't see the media you want in the world, like you have to make that media. So those are where my ideas come from.
And please feel free to respond directly to each other going forward. One of the things we talked about we teach a comic book writing class here, and which I taught for a bunch of years, and I work in prose and comics and TV and stuff. One of the things that like I'm always hit with when we're working on comics is what can be done uniquely, like in this form, that you can't do, or can't do as well than other forms. Do you think about what do you feel like you can do that you can't do with an essay or nonfiction piece or even a direct interview? And do you lean into that, or is that just a part of the process?
I'll lean into that. I mean, I think what's really exciting is that it is such a malleable form. We talk about comics as if it's this, really easily defined thing, but I think it's so plastic and malleable. And obviously, we've been telling stories with pictures for thousands of years, and so like listening to what Ben was saying, like I really try and extract myself from a personal frame when I go and do a story, and I think actually it's the way we can try and reframe reporting, for example, like leaving aside the production qualities for a second, but like the way, and what Sarah was saying about listening to people and being present with people, I think often a lot of the media stories that we report on, people are used to sort of people parachuting in and getting a snapshot or a talking head or a TikTok or whatever. Maybe not a TikTok, we'll get there. And instead of just sitting and when I do like a live sketch of someone, there's a different dynamic and a different paradigm, I think, that is quite unique to comic graphic reporting that sort of can't happen in another way, and becomes more of a sort of a dialogue, and then you can obviously see someone show someone how they're going to be represented. And then like on the flip side, I would say, yeah, hopefully I think we're just discovering the potential for the form in terms of the interactive possibilities and some of the agency you can have in terms of playing around with framing and contrasting multiple viewpoints. I think, yeah, there's a ton of fertile ground to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ben like really hit it in the head with it. You lose all sense, like when you're drawing something like a piece, it loses this like neutral air because it goes through the filter of whoever is working on that piece. So I feel like you kind of have to like lean into what the medium allows and what it is not. What is not, I think like you will never break news with a comic. Like, by the time that I finish like drawing a page, there's already like video essays and like reactions to like whatever, right? So that's not what I'm doing. So the comics format in terms of like the news or like nonfiction, it just serves like as a frozen moment in time. Like I feel like there's so much care that goes into it, so much resource, like human resources that go into like drawing a page and all of the effort, that it just like encapsulates a moment in time. And I think that's kind of like the beauty of the medium, to try to put it in like very, I don't know, maybe like flowery way, because at the end of the day, it just looks like drawing for hours something that in any other medium would just be like recording of an interview and then immediately putting it on air. So it kind of like forces you to, I don't know, think twice about how you present it, how you want the piece to be taken, how you want to make a point. I think I'm now like sorry to go in circles, but yeah.
What was the thing you said, Ben, about like as soon as you start drawing, you like start editorializing?
I think that's what I said.
That was really nice. Yeah. I think that's really true. I think like all journalism is made by people, but it's often hard to remember that, and a lot of like traditional media outlets are basically built to like the way that the stories are written and presented. You're not supposed to think about the people who are making them. It's like they remove all of the voice, they call it. So it's like this could have been written by anybody. And I think what's really nice about comics is that the hand of the creator is very clear. Like it's very clearly made by a person, and as a reader, I think you keep that in mind more. You're seeing like the line work and the colors they chose, and it just feels more handmade than like a text article, and therefore you're thinking about who made it. And I think that's really important for media literacy and for thinking about who makes the news, because you're thinking about, okay, as a reader, I'm thinking about what perspectives is this reporter bringing to this story? What kind of bias and experiences and history is this artist bringing to this story? So what filters is it passing through on its way to me? So I think that comics are really helpful for keeping that framing of like media is made by people in the minds of the reader. And I think it's also helpful in that way for building empathy with readers. I think that because it's like it's clearly made by a person, and you're saying, I care about this enough to spend all this time on it. So that's helpful for people to be like, here's why this is important. This person invested all this time in it. Like I can connect with that. And then also as comics, it's like such a visceral medium. You're seeing the people's faces and their clothes and like their expressions and how they feel. You can just really capture a strong emotional reality in comics that I find harder to capture in text. And I think that connects like instantly with readers. You can, to create that empathy between the subject of the comic and the reader, you just like feel what the person in the comic is feeling. So I like it for all of those reasons.
I was thinking about this. Trying to remember this guy's name, but I grew up in Western Massachusetts. But I like to say it's like not the crunchy part. It's like wherever, like if you have an accident, you know, on the 90 getting off at Lee to look at Leaves, and you're like, oh fuck, I'm stuck here for an afternoon. I gotta find the one guy to fix cars. I live next door to the guy that fixes cars, you know. So I grew up next to this guy, and he used to tell me about how he learned to read by reading comics. This is sort of a proletarian answer, sorry. But I always thought that there's something unique to that. There's something about the immediately recognizable or like understandable aspects, or like understandable. The narrative function of comics are so easily understood that someone, I forget what his name, probably Bob, he was able to sort of like conceptualize, the written word in that way, and he taught himself to read with comics, you know. And I do think, like something that Sarah was saying, there's a certain aspect of comics in which the reader, I think certainly more than video, and I think to a certain degree more than just text, there's like a participation in the simulation in comics that doesn't exist in other things, because the boundaries are right there, you know what I mean? Like, to actually look at a comic as a piece of art is ridiculous, right? It's like images and cells, you know what I mean? The words are over here. Why is a speech bubble the thing that means talking? That doesn't make any fucking sense at all. You know what I mean? That doesn't exist in the world. And there's even weirder things like that, like why is swearing, you know, why is that like a bunch of squeak? Yeah, like what the fuck is that? Or it's like, you know what I mean? But like over time we've accumulated sort of this understanding that these are like what these mean, and then as a cartoonist you can subvert those. You can add things, you can remove things, and that, you know, that's like whatever, making is sort of self-congratulatory as far as cartoonists, but whatever, we don't get paid a lot, so so it's fucking fine. But I guess that's what I think of. There is an accessibility aspect that I feel like is part of the form, and I think that's what draws me to it, in part because I'm a terrible writer. I'm not like Sarah. I can't write a whole book. That's not going to happen.
Aren't you writing a book right now?
There'll be pictures. There'll definitely be pictures. But yeah, that's the first thing I think of. These are good questions, thank you.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just gonna say, I also love comics for expressing uncertainty. I feel like if I'm writing a text piece, like an article or an essay, that essay has to have like a clear thesis and like a strong conclusion, and I have to like have a point. With a comic, I have to use comics to like sort through feelings. And so I don't have like a thesis statement or an argument that I'm making. I don't have a clear conclusion. I'm often just sort of exploring an idea. So if I'm writing a comic, for example, I made a comic in June about like how the pandemic has shaped my like gender expression and ideas about gender. I don't know what the answer is. I don't have like a conclusion there. It's just sort of like, wow, it brought up a lot of feelings, didn't it? And a comic was a good medium for expressing that, because I can just be like, I don't know, but like, here's what I'm thinking about, and like, here's what I'm seeing and feeling, and there's not like a tidy conclusion and like a 4-part argument to it. So I think because comics is like very expressive and there's not a lot of like constraints to the form, you can make it be whatever you want. It feels more freeing in that way for me to be uncertain.
Yeah, and something that I was going to mention is that when you think about the tool set that you have as a cartoonist, it's such a good medium to convey emotion, to convey like, I don't know, even like a moment in time, I guess. And as somebody who's like writing most of the time in his second language, I don't think that I could write a book. Like, that's not me. But working with a limited language, like my limited knowledge of English, but then having the addendum of just being able to like, whatever I do not have the words for, I can draw. It just kind of like feels very freeing to all of a sudden have like a very, very wide spectrum versus usually when I'm trying to find words and I'm like struggling. So it just, I don't know, it opens up what you can say in very little time. I mean, consuming it, not making it.
That's really beautiful, yeah.
I also think on that moment of time, it's the beauty of such a visual or like visual-centric medium is that you can explode that notion of time as well, and you're not bound by like a linear chronology or maybe such an ordered sequence. I think we can handle and process and make sense of like juxtaposed images or like contradictory images, or you know, in a way that maybe text is slightly more complicated because it's its own inherent sort of graphemes, and so I think there's more like affordances for the reader in that sense as well. I also think it's really interesting that all of us have celebrated and see the subjective strokes and representation as a sort of a transparent declaration of authenticity, to use a loaded term, and yet that's often the charge that's leveled at comics journalism, like you can't represent the news because it's, you know, it's drawn and therefore you're, you know, it's this corrupted, co-opted, which, you know, I think is, in this sort of post-truth environment, it's a lot more upfront about, look, this is just one window into a truth, there isn't a single truth, and it's suddenly, you know, so I think it's, yeah, inherently, I think it's funny that we all mention that, and yet that's often the first charge that gets leveled at a graphic journalist. It's like, how do you, this isn't appropriate, or this is got kids.
Where do you hear critiques like that?
What's that?
Where do you hear critiques or charges like that?
I mean, thankfully I would say you hear it less, for sure, and it's largely thanks to places like the Nib getting it out there more, for sure, but I definitely think, you know, if I'm cold pitching a news organization, I mean, they won't put it in such stark terms, they'll be like, huh, what, like illustrations? And you're like, you know what I mean? And I still, and I'm not gonna sort of name names, but like, I've still been I've been involved in investigations and done the reporting and done the graphic stuff, and I'm credited as an illustrator.
Right.
And I don't know about you guys, and I'm, it's so frustrating. It's like, I've made this case to you guys, and it's so different. I see it as very different to illustrate.
Yeah.
Not to denigrate any illustrators either, but it's like, it's, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is sort of another part of this, but I remember I wanted to do a comic about, or I wanted to write about this prison uprising that happened in 2017 in Delaware. That and part of it happened in response to prison conditions, but also Trump. You know, it was one of those prison uprisings that like they called into the news. It was very overtly political in this way that I thought was very interesting. But you know, obviously. Accessing anyone in a prison is already difficult, especially after they've just killed the prison guard. The prison's not really trying to let you talk to them. So then I was like trying to find family rights. So I was just, you know, I was on Twitter, you know, I was all over the place. And I found a lady whose family was in the prison, and I messaged her and I was like, hi, my name is Ben Passmore. I use some other euphemism to say comic journalist, but I was like, I'm a graphic journalist, you know, which sounds like I just write about graphic shit. But anyway, it's not a good word, but I was like, you know, I'd like to interview, and I didn't hear from her for a couple days, and then I got a message back, and it was just like, comics, is this a joke to you? That was it. I was like, but so there's that too, you know, and there's kind of like just a broader misunderstanding about like what the inherent quality of comics is. But also I'm trying to remember, I think in school they were like, the thing that comics does is that it works in sort of like, it works in this way that like the text and the art together create an experience that would be destroyed if you remove them. That's like the perfect comic. I don't really know what that means, but it does make me think how we do work. Like, sort of the job of the cartoonist is not really writer, not really artist, but we like work in this sort of this simultaneousness that I think is really, really interesting. That keeps me in comics in this way that I'm not particularly interested in other art forms in quite the same way. It's like, it's at this point my brain just works in this way in particular, and I find it really fascinating. And maybe is why, one of the reasons comics continues to be a thing that people fuck with for some reason. I'm saying fuck too much, it's just people mess with me. Who's recording? My family watches these videos sometimes.
That's lovely, leave it on.
When you say that, it reminds me of right after the 9/11 report happened. There was an illustrated, I can't remember who did it.
Sid Jacobson, yeah.
Right, and it's a really wonderful illustrated version of the 9/11 report. And immediately when it came out, there was a response by one of the survivors of, where they had lost a loved one in the event. And she was hurt. And she was hurt at the idea that somebody was going to get into comics. It was the exact same response. It was like, is this a joke to you? You know, and I think about that because I do think it's changed, and I watched it change over my life, you know, from when I used to buy comics in high school, and I remember I used to go to Fat Jack's Comic Crypt in downtown Philly, and they would give it to me in a brown paper bag, like it was the worst form of pornography you could possibly have. And the guy would look at me, he was like, open it when you get home. You know, so I could see it. To where I don't even have the discussions anymore about the authenticity of comics, but I think part of it is when I think of comics, I have a bunch of ancestors that I'm thinking of, that I'm pulling from. You know, that in the immediate sense, you know, then back through to, you know, anything from Mouse, and then going back, you know, in American comics, European comics, African, West African comics, all these different comic mediums. So when I'm coming to it, I'm seeing all these things, whereas a lot of other times I know when we say comics, they're seeing Daffy Duck and comics from the 1960s is what's in their head, basically, or really unsophisticated versions of Jack Kirby is kind of what they're thinking of. So to take that to the next question, do you see some certain comic people as your kind of, you know, literary ancestors, or are there anyone in particular who, you know, created your notion of what comics could be? It's a tough one.
One of them sitting in the front row.
Not too embarrassing.
I mean, like you said, there's a storied history, and you know, whether it's, you know, Franz Mazaril and the Wordless comic. Like you said, we could be here all day listing examples. But I think it's, in this sort of new incarnation of whichever wave of comics that we're in, it's like seeing the possibilities. It was like seeing those crazy splash pages and the sort of explosions of it. Being able to, like what you were saying, Ben, like in terms of you can treat a page as just something to be hypnotized by as you sort of spiral through the composition of it, or you can treat it as a piece of information, or you can situate it in a wider story. And so, like, there's no denying, like, you know, Wally Wood's line brushwork or Jack Kirby's stuff, you know, incredible artists, but I think, I guess I'm most interested in, like, the non-fiction constraints and what that can do. And I think it's really sad. The one thing that I would say sort of sensitively and respectfully to that woman is, did you read it before you make that judgment? And I think that's part of the problem, is that people have this sort of knee-jerk reaction, and they say it's inappropriate, and it's like, I can understand where that's coming from, but that artist may have really borne that in mind and taken those sensitivities in mind, and so, you know, much like with video games, there are video games that treat, you know, another much maligned, stigmatized form of media that have emotional journeys that are far more complex than like cinema with a capital C and all this stuff. So I think it's, you know, the work needs to go to the reader to actually interact with the art form, and then before they cast the first stone. It wasn't really your question, was it? It was about influences. So.
I love the idea of having comics ancestors, but that's not my experience, sadly. Like, I started drawing comics as a kid, and then just kept drawing them through high school, and would read comics like Mad Magazine, or a lot of comics by Sergio Arganes, who did this comic called Gru. But that wasn't the kind of comics I wanted to make. So it's kind of just making comics about my own life in high school, and then folding them up and photocopying them and giving them to friends. And I thought that I had invented that medium. And then I went to a comics convention and saw that there was other people making these things, and they called them zines or diary comics, and I was like, whoa, there's a whole world of this. And so then, it wasn't until reading Joe Sacco's work, who's here in the front row, that I really saw, like, oh, those are the kind of comics I want to be making in the future. That's where I want to get to. So his work really showed me, like, what is possible with comics in a way that felt like that's something I'm interested in. Like, I love Mad Magazine and stuff, but it's just, like, not my style of humor or writing or what I'm interested in talking about. And then the people that I, like, learn from, I feel like, are making comics right now. I'm really excited about, like, well, everyone who's at the symposium, actually, I feel like I learned from all of their work, and I'm constantly like, ooh, that's a cool idea. I want to be taking that style of pacing or that style of drawing. I feel like I'm constantly learning from artists who are making work now. Some of my favorite artists I learned from are Jillian Tamaki and Tilly Walden, are two people who I like follow and read all their stuff, and I'm like, that's the way you draw a person. And like, that's a way to express a feeling in a story that feels really powerful to me, and I'm constantly learning from people right now.
When I think of thinking of, I don't know, ancestry or who like I draw from, there's this Mexican cartoonist called Rius, who like I hated reading as a kid. I would finish the school year and some of my books would still come in the plastic. Like I was able to resell them like for the same price. Like it was just like a.
Were you reading his comics in school?
No, but like I didn't like reading, and then one of my history professors introduced me to Rius.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at that point that my parents were just happy that I was into reading any type of book. And I didn't even associate that it was comics that I was reading. It was until because Rius, he had a lot of books. I remember Stalin for Beginners, like Marx 101. Like he was Mexico has like a different relationship with communism, but that's a different panel.
I love you being like 12 years old and reading like Marx 101.
Yeah, but that's how I read about like Mexican Revolution, like World War II, and I remember like things stuck versus like me just reading the history book that was like assigned in the classroom. So. Then, like later in life, I started like getting into comics, or like superhero comics, other type of graphic novels, and it wasn't until like I started doing my own type of like journalistic like comics that I realized like, oh, I'm just doing the same. I'm just like trying to like copy Rius that had like this almost like visual essay format, but in comic book, like presented as a comic book. But that's somebody that I don't know if he's translated in English. But I would recommend it. His work is fantastic.
Yeah, I think some of this, I think like, I was a comic fan like really early. I was like little, like reading Calvin and Hobbes. I read like Tintin. I'd be like after school in the library, like looking for comics when there, before there's a comic section at the library. So I'm in there like, trying to make sense of a New Yorker comic. Like, I don't even know what a psychiatrist is. But I think for me, and I feel like, and I read superhero comics and stuff, but we didn't have a superhero comic store, right? We had like a Brooks Drugs with like one sad Spider-Man comic. I think for me, but I didn't, and I love drawing, like my mother really supported my drawing and stuff, so I was like, feverishly drawing all the time. I think in terms of, I did not think of these people as like predecessors necessarily, and even like, I guess like early 2000s, I was reading like Peter Cooper and like Seth Bachman. I was reading Joe comics too, coming up. I didn't necessarily think of these predecessors because a lot of them felt like these are white people in a lot of cases looking into people's lives that are like mine, And so there was this like mediation between me and someone that mirrors me. So often I really got used to just consuming comics as form first and didn't even really engage in nonfiction comics for a long time. Like if you read, like say, Dayglow A-Hole is like the series that I did, I didn't mess with nonfiction, you know what I mean? Because also like a lot of I'd go to conventions, I'd be one of maybe two black people there. It's like, I'm not really trying to like show my life in that way because I'm not really sure how you're gonna take it. You know what I mean? Like y'all are used to consuming people like me from the outside. I'm not really interested in that kind of access. And to be honest, I still produce with a certain guardedness. And more recently, I started working for the NIB, and I think I would have someone like Ron Wimberly who like did some nonfiction stuff, but works purely in genre, there'd be some, and he's only a couple years older than me. So there's a couple people who I think of my peers in the total way, you know what I mean? More recently, who I look to in a similar way, other nib artists, you know what I mean, other people out there. So like with some exceptions, I find myself like, I was definitely like a student in a way, in an informal way, of like form before I was fully inspired by the content. And now as someone who like works in nonfiction, I can go back, you know what I mean, as like a non-reader and be like, oh, this is really amazing. And I do feel like I learned from like some of the stuff that I initially just read as just like a reader, you know what I mean? But it is interesting, yeah, it has felt for the last couple of years like journalism, comics in a particular way has become more of a moment in terms of this, like the wide participation, which is exciting.
Yeah, it's funny when you said that the first commercial comic I did was for Vertigo. It was a spin-off of Hellblazer called Papa Midnight. And the idea was we're going to have an all-black, because it was a black topic, we're going to have an all-black creative team. And it took us like months. And Ron Wimberly was ultimately who did the covers for that. And at that time, like he hadn't even done anything, and we had to go find it because it just wasn't there. And hearing that, and hearing all of you talk, one of the things that hits me, and it hits me all the time when I'm reading this too, is that like this feels like a golden age. I mean, it feels like so many interesting art is being done, so many different types of comics, journalism. Even within the topic of comics journalism, we're talking about such a wide variety of ways of coming to the page. So I was just wondering, does it feel like that? Does it feel like this is an open territory and you can go in any direction, or does it the solitary act of creation, which is also a part of this, still make it feel like you're alone, or is it a combination of feeling part of a community and feeling like you're on your own? By the way, I'm gonna open questions to the room while they figure out what the hell I just meant. Come up with something better.
No, I totally get that. I feel both ways. I feel like there's so many really cool artists, and like younger people, older people. There's a lot of people to learn from and be excited about, and it's really cool right now. You have all the tools you need to publish your own work, so you don't have to get someone else's permission to publish, which is a really big deal. Like, 20 years ago, how would you get your work out there to everybody? You could photocopy it and hand it out, or you'd have to like get some publisher to say yes to your idea, which creates all kinds of like gatekeeping. So now it's like, if you have something you want to share, you can easily get it out there. And so, but then I also feel like the inverse of that, which is like those means of communication are mostly like controlled by tech companies, and we're just making them money. So I mostly share my comics on Instagram. I don't like that, it feels like, oh, I'm like sharing my work, and that's the way that I feel connected to people and less alone, is sharing my work out there and having people respond to it very quickly and say, oh, this connects with me and this resonates with me too, and being able to see other people's work. But the whole time it's like that sphere is just content creation for like a large, tech company. So who is that serving? So I feel both ways. I feel both alone and alienated and like connected. Yeah.
That's real shit. I think for me, myself, just personally, I feel like just a little too old to, not that I'm old, but like, I feel like the generations of, like the comics generations are like pretty short, you know what I mean? Like, I was only a couple years until I was like meeting people who were like, oh, I read your comics in high school, blah, 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 and they're a full-grown adult. I'm like, that's terrible. This is a terrible experience. But it is interesting. It's like people who are a bit younger than me, I think, feel this sort of like, they feel this entitlement to space within this sort of like broader sort of comics milieu in this way that I didn't. I was like, I think I experienced sort of like, and this is the thing that I think in certain aspects of indie comics especially still perpetuates to a degree. It's like one of the few art medias left in the United States where sort of like a certain kind of white guy feels like it's their thing, you know what I mean? And that we're like the other is not good at it, even though we make all the culture. But that, I've seen that break down, and I think for me, a part of me was like, I was like, all right, on some level, y'all are good. I think I noticed in myself this tendency to still be acting as a visitor in some way. You know what I mean? Not apologizing for me, but being like, at the end of the day, this is whatever, this is y'all's. And I think to an extent, like as Sarah said, like in a broader sense, like comic relies on the generosity of people who are ultimately maybe not great people. You know, like it's a very precarious, billionaires. But you know, whatever, devils. And both Yakubian and Naj. Who gets that joke? Nobody. That's how it breaks down every time. Anyway, so I think that's like, so in some ways it feels like cool to watch younger people feel more entitled to this space. I do think we have this problem, and I worry that it does seem like younger people have this assumption that tech is just a part of their lives in this way that makes me uncomfortable, because we do need to figure something out, maybe something that's more transgressive. But it is cool to have sort of more diversity in comics. That's the lame ending of
I feel like, and I don't know if I'm diverging a little bit from the question, but I feel like there's a lot of truthisms of comics, of like, you should always be, we're talking about, should always be sketching. I don't like that, but you should always be posting work. Like, that relationship to community online, like, I've never felt attached to it. I think, like, I don't feel a sense of community through social media, or through meeting necessarily people through social media, because that's not how I connect really. I feel like I am very guarded always online. So I'm actually more, in terms of like feeling the community grow, things like the NIP, like immediately having like a space where I could pitch ideas, and having like conversations with like Sarah and Larry and Andy, like that to me felt like the beginnings of a community in terms of the work that I was doing. And comic conventions, which is like when all the nerds gather and we get together. But it's, I feel like the community more so blossoms from the spaces that foster the art, independently of like whatever is happening online, on like social media. Because Instagram was never made to share like political comics or whatever, so it's always going to be something that you can find, but it's not really, it's like intended use.
I'm going to roll my sleeves up. I don't know, I feel like...
you work in tech.
Yeah, well, oh boy, it's like I'm one of the devils. I'm really fucking old as well. So, no, I would say I've had that same thing with like community. I never really felt part of it. I mean, coming out from CCS, and I should say there's like a scared CCS like showdown we should do. I think there was, maybe it's to a certain extent as well, and parking aside, like Ben said, you know, that the other theme about, you know, I'm very aware as a creator, and this is why my comments aren't personal, that I am the privileged white male, etc. voice. So that's why I leave that part. You know, it's not something I address in my work, because I feel like if other people can, you know, I let the diversity sort of ring true elsewhere. I don't. Yeah. But I think there is something about people that is almost like people are used to associate an inauthenticity, or like, unless you were like a zine making niche person who was like catering to a much smaller community. If you wanted to, you know, like going out and looking for software like collaborations, or trying to push your stuff into different places, made you out to be more commercial, and thereby, do you know what I mean? I don't think it exists as much now, but I think there certainly was like an aspect of like, oh, reckless self-promotion on Instagram. I mean, I definitely, it's just, I see it as a tool, like a kind of, I wouldn't say necessary evil, but it's like, in a way, we need to have those conversations, because we are, like, as visual storytellers, it's like, if we're left out of the conversation will still continue. And so we have all this visual literacy and all this power, like, all this expertise, not to mention like a polyphony of voices, And the nib does great stuff online, you know, it's like a responsive, optimized site that can reach people so much more because of that. And obviously there is the print, and I'm not saying that I'm saying this is a complement to it, but I think that's an interesting discussion. For me, I would say my sense of community is when you do like workshops like in places that don't maybe have as much Wi-Fi access or what have you, and you see that it's like people, it's sharing that act of drawing together and like fostering a sense of like making zines, like old school. Like funnily enough, I put mine on a website, Graphic Voices, but it's like similar sort of thing. Like, you know, Sharad Sharma does it in India with World Comics, like a single 8x11 piece of paper that people make comics of. And I think that's really that sense where I get the most sense of community. Like people being like, I made this comic and I'm going to make more comics.
Yeah.
You know, that's the really cool thing about it. I mean,
this is an interesting conversation to have now, just because they're having conversations about Facebook/Meta right now. You know what I mean? It's like the conversation about like the net benefit. You know what I mean? It's like the flaming hole is like, you know, burning up the souls of everybody, but you know, you can cook chicken on it. It's like how. I think the nice thing about comics, I think some of the thing that is hard, right, is that we live in sort of like this weird like nation where the idea of like pure action is on some level like an expectation that people have, or this sort of aspiration, and I think that competes with like whatever, like equivocating. I think we can have a pragmatic relationship with these things and ultimately be like, we can survive without it, which is how I feel, you know what I mean? I think that the nice thing about being able to draw is you can draw on basically anything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think, like when I'm thinking about like platforms with more equitability, I think about, and this is just incredibly on brand for me, but like there used to exist your local black bookstore, and they still exist to a certain degree, but because of gentrification, repression, yada, yada, a lot of them don't exist anymore. And that was one answer for sort of community-based stuff that happened, in which like we, or people in my community, not everyone on the panel, could control, you know, have some like measure of control. So this is like an old conversation. For myself, you know what I mean? Like, phones are bad for the planet. Meta seems to be bad for basically everybody, and Instagram is particularly bad for young women. However they decided to define that, I don't know, but it's clearly bad, you know what I mean? So I think that for me, that's true. Whether or not comics can be used in that space, like I've benefited a lot from Instagram. I've benefited from Tumblr before I was on Instagram, you know what I mean? That's the other thing. I think sourcing community, not mediated by tech companies, I think is important. So I ultimately agree with that. But you know, it is what it is also, you know what I mean? But you know, that being said, I would love to find another way, you know, for sure.
One thing I do to try and get around having my work be mediated by Instagram is that I publish all my zines, which are like made by hand, so they're an actual piece of paper that are folded up and drawn. I publish them all under a Creative Commons license, which means they're free to redistribute and reproduce for like nonprofit purposes. Which means that if you're a teacher or if you're an activist and you want to use one at a protest or you want to use one in a class, you're welcome to do that and take it. So it's like an alternative to copyright. And then I make them available for free on my website for people to download. And people download them every day, and like around the world. I get messages from people saying like, yeah, I'm using this template in a workshop in Australia or in a class in Mexico, and that's a really nice feeling of community, of like, oh, I drew this thing, I made it available for anyone to use for free however they want, and it's really cool to see where it winds up and how people are like actually printing it off and making something by hand, which feels cool.
Well, and something that I think you do very well is that when you show your scenes, there's never the scan, like, or almost never the scanned version. It's always like the photo of the scene, which kind of like always makes the point of there's a physical form of this. So that kind of like invites people to reproduce it, to like engage with it in a different way than if it was just like scanned the pixels, and then it's like, that's it, this is the final piece, this is the product, this is where it's meant to live. So it's also like how you present it and what you want from each project.
Yeah, the time when I feel really connected to community of any kind is when someone says, oh, I read your work and it inspired me to make my own thing. And I'm like, yes, that's great. And I do the same thing. I'm always responding to other people's work and saying, oh, I want to make something about that topic because you inspired me to do that. So I love that kind of connection.
Okay, do any questions in the room? Thank you.
Hi there, my name's Zoe. I'm a postgraduate curatorial fellow here at the JSMA, and part of my job is giving tours of all the exhibits, specifically and mostly to University of Oregon undergraduate classes. So my question is, what would you like me and other people who are giving tours to convey to students about your work?
Hi, Zoe. Thanks for your work. I think that people can be intimidated by a show in a museum because it looks very professional up on the walls. You know, you got your name up there and nice lights and everything. And I would say, I feel like I'm always just making it up as I go along. And I'm really guided by my own curiosity. And so it's not something that feels like I think that if you see the work as it is on the wall, you might feel like it's never something I could do because it looks so nice. But I would say it's absolutely something you can do. Like, I don't care who you are. Like, if you want to draw, you can draw, and if you want to make comics, you can make comics. So I hope people take that away from the show and feel inspired to do their own work rather than being like, oh, this is so good, I'll never be able to draw that well. I'll just stop now.
Yeah. I mean, when you see it on the wall, and thank you so much for how you present our work. It's fantastic. But at the end of the day, it's a piece of paper. I mean, it's something that is so accessible for everybody. So the barrier for comics is way lower. The entry barrier is so much lower than people assume. It's generally like if you ever have like an idea bouncing around, it's so much easier to get into comics than any other art medium, I think. How sustainable that decision is, that's up for debate. But yeah, I mean, I echo that feeling.
I would like everyone to just know how talented I am. I'm very healthy.
So young.
Yeah, I'm very young and I have all my hair. Write that down. Sturdy hairline. I think when I produce something, it's usually I think partly because it's hard for me to think abstractly about all the people everywhere. I usually write for a specific group of people, and it's coming from an anarchist milieu. It's a community that's very active. It uses information. I didn't read books in high school. You know what I mean? The first things I ever read was like I needed to answer a question, which I guess is theoretically what they're supposed to teach you in high school. That's not what I learned. I learned to sell weed. I'm joking. Stolen stereo. But when I produce something, it's in my mind, it's a people that are going to use the information. You know what I mean? And use whatever I'm giving them as part of a continuum of understanding to go out and do something, legal or illegal. Yeah.
I'd say on that continuum, it's like to not think that this is it. Like they, might have an idea for combining it into another form that we haven't figured out yet. That's like in a couple of years, there might be another part of this whole thing that goes on a different format and takes on a different world. Or like audio, I mean, I don't know. Like where this might go, who knows? But I think it's like maybe take this as a stepping stone and see that their opportunity to change it is invaluable. So that they're inspiring us.
I'm wondering if you all ever feel constrained by the politics of the day, or on the flip side, political correctness, and more specifically to Gerardo, have you worked in Mexico as well? And do you feel constrained there, or is it all the same? So that's my question.
I haven't really worked a lot in Mexico. Even like when I was living there, I was mostly working for the U.S. I did translate comics for consumption for Spanish speakers. Like some comics, they just feel like kind of have to. It's kind of like either about Mexico or for Mexico, so I should also consider like the language barrier there. But to be completely honest, I have never really given much thought to political correctness, whatever. Like I feel like that term can be used in like any different subject to mean like so many different things. So I think that at the end of the day, I just always treat comics and treat like the subject that I'm talking to with a lot of respect. And that's always what I try to do. Like if I have an interview with somebody, I'm not gonna like then draw them like doing something that kind of like affects what they were saying, or I wouldn't like. I have no training in journalism at all, so so I like try to be careful like not to guide them in a certain direction with like a question or things like that. So I try to be very mindful, and those are the only kind of like barriers that I put myself. Obviously, there's like I don't want my work to be misconstrued for something that I like to miss a point. So I'm very careful in like trying to build a point to show like where I'm coming from, what I mean, and what I want the piece to reflect. But that's my only concern when I'm doing a comic.
Yeah, I think a lot about am I representing people accurately and thoughtfully in my work, which I think ties into this sort of like the idea of political correctness is that, oh, if you say something, people will get offended by it, and therefore you just shouldn't say that. I actually like I feel like I've learned a lot about like how like we need to respect people's experiences and ideas about themselves and their body and their lives, and so that's how I try to approach making comics, is like making sure that everyone, if I'm writing about other people, that they feel really like respected and well represented in the way that I am representing them. So that means, for example, with Guantanamo Voices, which is a book about people who have much different experiences than me, including people who are incarcerated, sharing the scripts for the comics with them to read over and review before we publish them, and then looking at the pencils, so the drawings, and be like, does this represent your experiences, or does any of this feel offensive or misrepresentative to you? And that's not something all journalists do, but for me it was really important to make them feel like they're going to be represented accurately and thoughtfully in this book, and they know what's coming, rather than being surprised when it comes out about what quotes I chose and how I told their story. Because you're telling somebody else's story in that case, and that's a huge, huge burden and an honor to be able to share that. And in terms of like feeling constrained by politics of the day, I think the only way I feel constrained is that like everything is like relentlessly depressing, and I don't have a new thing to say about it. I feel like, I don't know, when I first started being a journalist, I was like really hungry to like kind of like have a take on everything, and now my take is just the same every day. You know, it's like, yeah, capitalism is a trap. You know, once again. The problem. And so I feel constrained by feeling really like repetitive and kind of like mired in a bad situation. But I often think like, if I want to make a comic about something, I think like, am I really adding something by writing about this topic? Like, what do I have to say about this? And is it like my place to talk about that, or should I make space for someone else to talk about this instead? So I don't like do a lot of comics on every single thing I think of every day. I've really tried to more like listen and step back and support other people's work, unless I have something that's very true to my personal experience that I want to share on that topic. So I think like as a creator, I'm defined like as much by like what I don't make as by what I do make, because there's a lot of things that like I don't talk about, because it's not something where I feel like, oh, I really have something to add to that. Like, do we really need like one more white woman saying like, Trump's bad, you know? I don't know. So it doesn't seem super helpful to me, so.
Okay. I'll just add, I mean, I think, being respectful is critical. I mean, like, the latest thing I'm working on is about underage asylum seekers trying to get asylum in the UK and passing through Europe. And I think, obviously, again, it's not my story, much like the example you gave in Guantanamo Voices. The best thing you can do is honor their story and be truthful to their story and show the people who think they're a bunch of, state sponging, etc., that this is actually the conditions that they're being forced to live in. This is the real violence they're facing. And part of the reason that we can tell those stories is because we don't have giant cameras on our backs, because the French police will come after you if you do. So, I think it's, just the essential sort of journalistic tenets of like, be respectful, be true to your sources, and for that reason, like stepping back when it isn't really your voice that needs to come to the fore.
Yeah. Whenever I hear the phrase, was it politically correctness? I feel like today, like people are talking about identity politics in terms of like gender and sexuality, but I always think of like the 90s when people were like, is it black, is it African American? So that's my association. If everyone wonders, I'm light-skinned and over-opinionated. But I don't actually really know what it means. I mean, you might mean something specific. I don't really know what it means, or sort of the politics of the day. Do you mean identity politics of the day, or just like tariff tax and like Ukraine or something? Just okay, all right. Just because I don't fully know what it means. I think like when I was growing up, I used to make comics for myself. And that was the space for me to say whatever. But I make comics to communicate to people, to share things with people, and I don't really see the function in being offensive most of the time. I mean, certainly outrage is like one of the many tools we have, right? But I find that like my desire or to subject people to like outrage is not focused down. You know what I mean? Like most of the time. So I don't really see the function. I had a similar conversation with a friend of mine who's from Alabama, who I was friends with in college, and he was when we were sort of first. I think I had like made my first sort of like trans and like genderqueer friends. You know what I mean? And I was just telling him about how my friends, and he was like, man, that just sounds exhausting, like trying to like remember theys and thems. I was like, what do you mean? Like, it's just not that difficult. These are my friends. They would like things from me. You know what I mean? Like, it's not extra work. I want these people in my life, So I guess it's like I don't see any reason to not respect what people need for themselves, I have my own issues with identity, and it certainly doesn't help me for people to refute it when people have, I think in terms of being constrained, I don't know. It seems it's sort of like what's the opposite choice to like not watch the news? Like my life doesn't really change, you know what I mean? Like when I think about like the politics of the day sort of related, I was young, sort of at the tail, like I was a kid with like the super predator shit, like I was locked up. That feels like very constrained by the politics of the day, you know what I mean? So in that way, I'm not locked up anymore, so I'm not that constrained. But I don't know, it's like sometimes the sort of the idea that you can voluntarily remove yourself from like, politics or sort of like the stress of everyday life doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. I think it's the two choices are sort of like despair and looking for some options, So for me, and that's never changed, you know what I mean? Like, I was talking to someone the other day, like, I picked up a Marcus Garvey book when I was a teenager. What teenager cares about black nationalism in 1920? Clearly one that is looking for answers, you know what I mean? I should be caring about the Transformers, you know what I mean? So for me, it's like, that's the function of politics, you know what I mean? It's some answers. It's some answers for despair. So for me, it's like the politics, that's the water we're swimming in, you know what I mean? And it's not a choice to not do. But yeah, that's my answer.
Cool.
What don't you like about the medium?
That's my favorite question.
So the question was, what don't we like about the medium of comics?
The paper.
The paper.
I'm just joking. I don't even draw on paper no more.
Yeah. I don't, this is like a very small thing, but I don't really like conventions because I don't like selling stuff. So I don't like how a lot of community is around selling your work. You know, so a lot of community with comics is like, you go to a comics convention, you sit behind a table and you have your stuff and people come and buy it from you. And I just don't like feeling like, oh, there has to be like a financial transaction for me to talk to you about my work.
Yeah.
So I would like to get away from having to sell stuff in order to talk to people. And if we could have some sort of different model for conventions where like you're not stuck behind a table selling stuff, that would be great. So that's one thing I don't like that comes to mind. I do think that it's like, I wish that more journalistic outlets like embraced comics. I think as Dan was saying, sometimes you're pitching like a more traditional media outlet and they're just like, I don't know, it seems like not really what we do. It's like, And I'm like, comics are like a very engaging medium that tells stories extremely well in a really personable way. Like why don't more journalistic outlets get on board with that? So I think the whole just like the disconnect between like journalism and comics is always frustrating to me. Like, get on board, guys. Like, read some comics and see their potential here. So that's frustrating to me.
I feel like the thing that I dislike about comics is basically everything that is not the act of like making a comic. Even for example, like trying to get comics like mailing, pitching something. I feel like the industry is so willing to like dump millions of dollars into whatever remake of a movie that has already been made. It's like, yeah, that sounds good. But when it's comics still kind of like has to justify its existence constantly in the market. And that's the one thing that it's, that's the rough part about doing comics. But everything else, I mean, maybe in what I was saying before, it sounds like there's some other things that I didn't like, but no, I will take all of those. I mean, I love that part, but yeah, it's a challenge.
I feel like I have this big issue. So like, I have a really hard time, particularly in nonfiction comics, fitting all the text into a caption. I feel like I'm constantly.
So you want more words?
Yeah, I'd like more. I'd like to be able to drop down. You know what I mean? And then like go back up or something. And oh my God, trying to fit quotes into like a word bubble. People talk entirely too long. You know what I mean? Like I've been doing interviews and I'd be like, this would be a really great quote if this was a novel. Can you please? You know what I mean? But you can't say restate. Restate this, please. That was too long for my stupid comic. You know what I mean? It's the fucking worst. You know what I mean? So there's that. I also sometimes wish, I think because I came up through sci-fi comics and now most of the work I get is nonfiction stuff, which is great. I like doing nonfiction stuff. I'm happy I'm here. But I would also sort of wish that we could get as much money for like big serious books that could sort of like do this genre switching that Bollywood movies does. Because I would love to have like a serious stern comic about like Martin Luther King's sort of like hypocritical relationship with like the Deacons for Defense. And then in the middle, I don't know, it's sci-fi. Let's just do it. You know what I mean? Let's just see what, I wish we could do that more, but I don't know. I feel like there are specific sort of expectations that come with being, like once you're seen as a certain kind of artist, it can be very difficult to move out of that, and I think that that's unfortunate. Like there's other kinds of art where you don't get sort of like stuck in, and I think some of it has to do, maybe, I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but some of it has to do with like, oh, you're proven in this area, so do this, blah, blah, blah. But I think that that's a bummer, you know what I mean? I would love to see people who are like known for something be like, yo, what do you really want to do? You know what I mean? Let's see the furries comic, you know what I mean? Like, what sort of like YA furries, John, are you trying to do? John is, the thing, a book. Yeah, these are my irreverent thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'd agree about the like pigeonholing. I think it's like like Gerardo was saying as well, as a single creator, you're like kind of expected to be this brand or promote yourself and have a shtick, and that's what people come to you for. So you're that person, or this is you. That tends to, I would find, like what it is. And so, and even in a way, like the newspaper editors, they're like, oh, it's a comic, so they have their preconceived notions. So I think similarly, like if you could say, here's just a story, and we've happened to file that. With, as a mixture of words and pictures, it's still the same story. Like the New York Times did one about a boxer, I can't remember when, but it started as text, and then it actually had an interlude of comics, and then it went back to text. And I think they've taken some experiments. I actually made a terrible pop-up. Everyone loved those pop-up ads, so I had a comic where trying to solve that problem. It was online, and you would click on the speech blues to hear audio. But like, again, it turns out like people click and then the audio isn't done fast enough, so they passed it, so that's like, but I think the thing, that kind of annoys me is, again, it's like a refusal. It's like, whoa, where are you running to? Like, we're just getting started with this form and we just know what to expect from it, so let's have it kind of like genre music, like you were saying, it's like, I want the Stones to play these tracks, the best of, like rather than like, I don't know, or Dylan with the electric guitar, like, and so it's, I think the form will only evolve if we continue to make these ridiculous, weird experiments and see where other people see that and then take it.
Oh yeah, and then I also think like, I feel like I know a lot about comics and I have like, my life is comics, and then I realized that like my world of comics is like a tiny piece of the big pie of comics world. And I'm like, oh yeah, like most of comics is like superhero comics and manga, and like I don't read or deal with those at all. And so I have to keep in mind that like, oh yeah, the world of comics that I love is like this much in like a pie that's this big. So yeah, I guess the rest of comics.
Time for one last one.
Cool. Hi, I'm Lauren. I had the pleasure of interviewing Harado and Dan in this whole process, and I still have more questions. So I work in like kind of like areas of comics that a lot of people don't know exist, like editing and lettering. People think it's just, you make comics and that's it. It's like, no, there actually can be up to like 20 people on like one comic and you don't even know. And so like when you're working with like nonfiction and like journalism journalistic comics, like how does that work when you're working with like a team of people? Like how is the script writing different, and how are you like, I don't know, I kind of wrote it down but then I forgot. I guess like more specifically, since Dan, you also work with VR and AR, and that takes a lot of people to get done. And then Sarah, you mentioned that you sometimes pass your script back to the people that you've interviewed, but I feel like a lot of times, like maybe other like journalists maybe don't have that luxury of like being able to even contact somebody again that they interviewed, or something like weird comes up and you can't like check it. Like, how do you make sure that the collaborators are understanding the weight of the thing that you're working with, or like how you're making sure that they're not imagining something entirely different if they're storyboarding for you, or throwing text on top of a part of the comic that you're like, that doesn't help.
Well, I would say it's funny actually, this kind of reminds me, I left out of the previous question what I dislike most. Actually, part of it is just how isolating it can be, or like how much time people think that, being a cartoonist is like you hit the jackpot and every day is a joy, and you get the joy doing board and sunshine and rainbows, and it's like, there's much obviously like writing, but it's a ton of time where it's just you alone with your thoughts, and so I think the collaborative aspect is actually, on the projects that I have worked on, has been really great. Yeah, sure, there are obviously times, in particular I can remember like translating comics, when you've made the cardinal mistake of drawing in the speech balloons for the English version, and then you're like, oh, like why is Ukrainian, why do they just have so many more words compared to English? And don't get me started on Devanagari as well, like having someone translate it and then be like, yeah, that word doesn't make any sense, in design, and but I'd say there's, it's kind of the swings and roundabouts, and kind of like the collaborative graphic novel writing courses that you mentioned. Like, those are incredible ways to try and get past that and give people windows into what is kind of an incredible process. So I think, yeah, you can try and previs with like thumbnails and storyboards and give people as many sort of cues to what you're trying to do. But fundamentally, I guess you accept it as just a kind of like a hybrid vision, and that kind of actually makes it a great deal more enjoyable, I would say, the more communal it is.
Yeah, I would say I often work as a comics editor, so I feel that like you're behind the scenes, and I often say that as an editor you get none of the credit and all of the blame, because if something's wrong, someone's like, "Who published this?" And if it's good, people are like, "The writer's brilliant," and you're like, "Yeah, you're welcome." So it is kind of like a funny invisible scene, but I also like feel like I love doing that kind of work where it feels like I'm basically like shepherding someone else's work to publication, so like helping them get it to be really strong, with keeping the audience in mind, and like making their voice very clear and what they're saying very clear to the reader is what I'm always thinking about as an editor. And the way that we work at the Nib, and what I also do with my own comics, is that I'm working with a team. We write the script first, so I write out, it looks just like a movie script, frame by frame, what's the text in each panel, and what's the image going to be in each panel. And then, is it a quote, or who is it? And that's, if it's a journalistic comic, that has like footnotes and is fact-checked. And so then we take the script, which is just text, and send it to the artist who does thumbnails first and sends that back, and I look over the thumbnails and say like, oh, we should move this here, we should move that there, make some edits, and then they do pencils, and then inks, and then colors. So by the time it gets to the final draft, we should have had any conversations already about things that I think aren't working. And I try to give a lot of like agency to the artists. Like, I just give them the script and they can kind of like take it and do what they want with the thumbnails, and you can see how it looks. And if they say, I think we should change this or change that, I'm like, great, brilliant, let's do that. And I've never had a situation where the artist and I like just didn't connect. And yeah, so I think that having those check-ins works really well, because what you don't want to have happen, and like some people do this when they're starting out with comics, is like drawing the whole comic first and then sending it to an editor, and then the editor's like, yeah, we need to change a dozen things about this. And you're like, I just spent a month drawing this comic, I'm not going to change this. Like, before you draw the comic as a final draft, you want to make sure all the changes are in there. So that's what we've really learned kind of the hard way, is like, once it gets to, you should do your edits at as early as possible, so that by the time it gets to the final draft, everyone's crystal clear on what's going to happen and how it's going to be. And I've edited some of Harado's work. Is that true?
No, yeah, very much so. Because and even like, I hear you talking, I've been on both sides. I've been like edited by you, but now I'm working as an editor myself. So, and I'm an editor at a weekly publishing company at that. So it's trying to understand that the creators have a vision for the project, but sometimes the vision might be a little bit, not conflicting, but like a little bit different. And it's just like trying to kind of like direct all of those visions in the same direction. Maybe the colorist has like an idea for a scene that the person who like drew it was not envisioning. But it's just kind of like learning to let go of certain things. Of like, oh, is this in service of the comic? Is that where my pushback is coming from? Or is this just because I had something already in mind? And same thing like being an editor. It's sometimes like you start to kind of like complete the story in your brain and you realize like, oh, that's not where the story's going, but is this a better story? Is this good for what it's trying to say or whatever it may be? So it's always trying to keep the project in mind, and just like whatever benefits the project, then that's king.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've done, I'm both like definitely a diva when it comes to like my own stuff. So like, I love a copy editor, but like definitely, I think I'm generally a nice person, but if like you give me edits on like major content, I'll be like, Yeah, respectfully, no. You know, I have more recently. I did a fiction book with my friend Ezra, and he was the writer and I was the artist, and that was very different. You know, I'm like functioning. You know, I'm trying to figure out like how to fill in the gaps, like how the pacing will work. I'm really trying to play out this thing that Gerardo said, where it's like we're making something new, and that was really cool. More recently, I've been working on this comic with this guy Lawrence through this organization called the Marshall Project, and it goes into a magazine that's just distributed within prisons. And Lawrence spent 27 years in prison in New York City, and this is a fiction comic, but it's about 4 guys based on people he knows in prison, you know. And I don't really know anything about being in prison for 27 years, you know what I mean? So I there's only so much feedback I can give, right? So I'm drawing it, but so like what I can do is I can make sure it works, and he is not even writing it, he's just giving me information to build stories around, which is really interesting. Part of it is scary. This is a comic about prisoners for prisoners. I don't want to make a corny work, you know what I mean? But also it's like I only have so much control because I don't know the content, you know, and that's been really interesting, like how to make something where I am writing and I'm drawing it, but I'm like getting a lot of heavy feedback from Lawrence, and we'll go through many stages of edits, like many different stuff that I would never put up with at the end. You know what I mean? You know, like 6 different versions of the script, and like, nah, I'm good. Like, this is what we're doing. But it's really cool because it does form into something totally different than what I would do. You know what I mean? And that's been really cool.
Well, we are already at the end of our time. Thank you so much for your openness and your generosity and for sharing all that with us. Let's get a big hand.